quiet group. All right. So everybody should have gotten an agenda and some additional information for today's meeting. Basically, the agenda, we're going to do a series of updates, just general sort of progress reports, etc., on various work elements for the FMP. Shannon will go through those. And then we have Gordy Reeves and Dana Warren, who are joining to talk about the aquatics and riparian strategy. We'll have about a half hour for that, both for them to sort of give an overview as well as an opportunity for folks to dialogue a little bit with them about that. And then Matt Powers is going to join us to talk a little bit about the extensive silviculture approach. And then we want to save some time with you to talk about next steps, progress, and upcoming meetings, including a June proposed field tour. So, and we may need there was a date floated for that, and I think it sounded like from the OSU side, it may conflict with commencement, and we may need to adjust the date a day or two, one direction or another potentially. So we'll talk a little bit about that, and really also sort of what you all would want to see being out on the forest together. So any questions, comments about the agenda? And I don't think we have any members of the public, but if you members of the public that are interested in making public comment, just shoot me a chat or Jenna a chat, and we'll try to save some time at the end of the meeting for public comment. With that, Shannon, are you ready to go ahead and kick us off?
Sure, I can do that.
Thanks.
Okay, hopefully everyone can see that okay. So we wanted to take the first part of this meeting and give some updates on the forest management plan and the process that we're in on a couple of key areas, and also hopefully have some time for discussion and feedback before we get into talking about the aquatic and riparian strategy and extensive silviculture with Gordy, Dana, and Matt. So first, just wanted to give an update on the science working groups, and this is something that we've talked about in the past, but just as a review and an overview, these working groups are a representation from a range of expertise. They are forming to contribute to the FMP development. So we have a range of subject matter experts that are contributing within each of these groups over the next few months, bringing together different perspectives on each topic. So you can see here in this figure, the range of working groups that we have coming together. And so we're going to look at a couple of these in more detail today, but you can see the main ones here: landscape analysis, which we'll talk about today, the monitoring plan, which connects very closely with several of these different groups, aquatic and riparian strategy, which Gordy and Dana will talk about, the Triad experimental design and adaptive management. This is a very significant group, and again, has a lot of connections to the other working groups. We've identified this restoration experiment for plantations in reserve, the extensive silviculture group, which Matt will be talking about today. And in some cases, you'll see some subgroups here where there are more focused groups coming together around specific areas that are really related very closely to a larger group. And so in this case, this is the adaptive silviculture for climate change group here. You'll see species conservation strategy, including subgroups and connections to the HCP, and then a financial analysis group. And then down here at the bottom, you'll see, again, some other groups forming that are related to these working groups up here. So data management systems, education and outreach, recreation and public access, and the research forest managers and directors group that's been advising throughout this process. So as I said, many of these groups are integrated with each other, and that happens through a combination of the group leaders meeting together and making sure that we're coordinating across the groups. It also happens through individual members who may be parts of several groups and the core OSU team who's bringing all of these different people together. So for example, the leaders of the Aquatic and Riparian Strategy Group would also play a role in the Triad Experimental Design and Adaptive Management Group, really making sure that the terrestrial and aquatic and riparian pieces are fully integrated in the FMP, as well as being connected to groups such as the Marbled Murrelet Experimental Strategy, where there's an overlap with riparian areas. Another example is this subgroup right here that I mentioned interacting with the larger group. So in this case, the subgroup is focused on climate smart silviculture, which includes applying the tools from an approach from this national experimental design and program to the climate change adaptation treatments and silvicultural strategies. And this has a large overlap with extensive silviculture. And then this group would also, of course, interact very closely with the Triad Experimental Design Group. So we have identified people for these groups and are continuing to work with partners to identify people and bring them in. And this includes both from within OSU and from other institutions. So the College of Forestry, OSU's Department of Fisheries, Wildlife, and Conservation Sciences, tribes, state and federal agencies, other universities, and members of the advisory committee. And so the goal for each of these working groups is to bring together people from relevant areas of expertise while keeping the group small and nimble enough that, that we can make substantial progress on the work products. And so to accomplish this, we have within each of these working groups a smaller core team that is responsible for more of those products, with additional reviewers or advisory members who help throughout the process and are a part of that development. An additional piece here is bringing in expertise to work with these groups. And one area that we've discussed in the past and have identified is the Coast Range forest management expertise. So I wanted to turn it over to Katie to give any updates that she'd like to share on that.
Sure. Nice to see you all again. The request for proposals or quotes is out, and you guys have been instrumental in helping spread it, and we've had a fair amount of interest, and I've talked to several people who are going to submit, and they had really good questions. Sounds like a very insightful group of people that have that I've talked with, and or groups of people, I should say. And so I'm expecting, you know, some good outcomes of that, but we will know more at the end of the month when we actually get the proposals in. And we did have a common question: is, are we looking for a single contractor or multiple, or, you know, somebody that has all these skills? And our answer to that question has been pretty consistent, that we recognize that a single individual is not going to have all those skills, but we're willing to put together a team or a group of contractors if that's what's needed, or we're also willing to go with having an already established group of people. So we're very open to ideas, and we recognize that we're asking for a lot of breadth. So any other questions?
Katie, do you have a sense of timeline for getting an individual or a set of individuals on board?
Well, if this closes the end of the month, I think we should expect that we may want to talk to some people, and that might take a couple weeks to schedule. So I'd say sometime into April.
Thanks.
Yep.
Are there comments or questions? Okay. Shannon, next update.
Okay. So just wanted to give an example, given the time, of what some of these working groups look like. And so we'll talk about landscape analysis today. We have a group that's been been working together on the modeling and landscape analysis with representation from University of Oregon and OSU. So you can see their names here. We also have a financial analysis group that has come together and has been meeting and working through some of the details, and we'll have an update on that today as well. And then, of course, this Triad experimental design group. You can see a list of names here, including OSU and members of the advisory committee. And we've had discussions with all of these people and are continuing to work on confirming. So that's why you'll see a couple of asterisks here. But this group is moving forward as well as the others. So as I said, each working group is contributing to products related to the FMP, and in many cases co-writing sections of the FMP based on their area of focus. And so for the purposes of this meeting and the time that we have, we wanted to highlight the ongoing work in a couple of these groups in particular. So as I said, we'll hear from Gordy and Dana on the aquatic and riparian strategy. We'll hear from Matt Powers on extensive silviculture. I'll give some updates on Triad experimental design and the landscape analysis, as well as the financial analysis group, and also touch on the monitoring plan development, as several of these groups are connected to that and the planned upcoming work there. So first, looking at the Triad experimental design and adaptive management group, the main outputs from this group are finalizing the proposed treatment allocation for the Triad design, including the partial watersheds. This is all based on the work, again, that had been done in the research proposal, as well as application of additional criteria and some updated data that we have acquired and are continuing to gather. So this includes developing the criteria for and ranking of the watersheds beyond the criteria of looking at stand age from the ODF data that we have. And this will help determine the early implementation of the design and ranking where to look at first for applying the experimental design in the early years of the Elliott State Research Forest. This group, because this is so closely linked to the adaptive management strategy, this group will also look at outlining the phased implementation strategy and adaptive management. So beyond the first few years of the Elliott State Research Forest, how do we scale up across the forest and apply the learnings from the initial experiments and research coming off the forest, including the decision-making points from those early study results, and a list of trigger points and associated monitoring needs for adaptive management. So you can see how this is really closely tied in with the monitoring plan. We need to understand what are our decision-making points from a research management perspective, so that we can be sure that we have the full suite of data needs included in the forest management plan and the startup of the forest, as well as making sure that we're monitoring the factors that we need to detect those trigger points for adaptive management when they're present on the landscape. So this group's work is based on, as I said, the foundation of the experimental design and the allocations in the research proposal, as well as new ideas that build on that framework, interactions with other working groups, and new information that we are accessing at this stage. And there's an example of that in a few slides. And this includes the discussion and incorporation of new ideas under this framework. And there are several current examples of this. One is a recent mini symposium that several members of the Elliott team participated in, along with international researchers, delving into the ways in which Triad is being applied and studied around the world, as well as the proposed research for the Elliott and questions for further investigation. Another example is a letter that Tom shared with this group describing a potential approach that relates to both the experimental design, adaptive management group, and the adaptive silviculture for climate change group. And if Tom is here, I wanted to turn it over to him to see if he had anything that he wanted to add to that.
I don't see Tom with us right now.
Okay. If he joins later, we can circle back to him then, if that's okay, Peter.
Yeah.
Okay, so moving on to a snapshot of one of our other working groups, landscape analysis and modeling. We've given a couple of updates on this effort over the past few months, but wanted to share some additional details. So we have the group I outlined earlier, Melissa Lukash and Neil Williams from University of Oregon, who are working on Landis 2 and applications to the Elliott. And then we also have a team here at OSU, Bogdan Strimbu and Todd West, who are working on another landscape model called iLand. And then Deanne Carlson, who's been really instrumental in a lot of the spatial analysis, as well as other areas of the research proposal, has also been heavily involved in this group. And so this group is looking at modeling on the Elliott for the purposes of the forest management plan, as well as some of the foundational information that will be built on through research on the Elliott. And so you can see here, these two models have a different approach to arriving at their answers for landscape scale analysis. And there is also built into this process a sensitivity analysis with multiple scenarios and runs of these models. So just some very high level differences. Landis 2 is a cohort based model focused around cells, whereas iLand is an individual tree model. Some of the example capabilities, there's quite a bit of overlap in the information and outputs from these models. But a couple of areas that we're looking at in particular with Landis is looking at fire history, including a regional simulation that includes a buffer around the Elliott, so that we can look at through our data collection, both the fire history of the area and then also include projections with this model. And so the group has been meeting to determine the appropriate geographic location for that buffer, as well as the size and the trade-offs between the cell size that can be modeled and the time that it will take to do that. The other example here for iLand is there is a steep slope. There's an ability to incorporate steep slope harvest costs. And this is was information and research that was recently published just in the last month or two that Bogdan is drawing on here for iLand. The iLand team is also completing some work on forest inventory using both above and below canopy LiDAR with a ground measurement component. And that data will be used as input for both models. So in this case, we have groups working separately on each of these models and then coming together to coordinate regularly. So this figure shows a high-level view of the approach for model parameterization, calibration, and outputs. And so work, as I said, is currently underway on these models for the Elliott. The group is coordinating on the input data and being able to compare apples to apples as these models arrive at their answers to two different approaches. So that includes the Elliott data set here, as well as choosing climate scenarios. You can see calibration happening here. And then the suite of outputs from these models. And this is a figure that Bogdan put together to show how these groups are coming together.
Shannon, we had a question from Mark Stern in the chat related to the buffer that you referred to around the Elliott, whether you could explain that a little bit more. And Mark, feel free to weigh in here.
Well, you mentioned a buffer, so I didn't really know what that meant. Obviously, I mean, that's sort of a hypothetical modeling buffer, or there's no fire coming in from the outside, or I wasn't quite sure what the buffer translated to, what that meant exactly.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. So the buffer is for modeling purposes around the Elliott. So you have the boundary of the Elliott. And then if we're looking at a regional approach of how fire actually moves across the landscape, it doesn't just spring up on the boundaries of any one forest or area. And so the buffer is designed to include, in the case of the model, cells outside of the Elliott to look at the vegetation surrounding the forest. It also includes some information that the group has been gathering on wind patterns and incorporating all of that into this model so that it's a little bit more realistic and reflective of what would happen on the ground in the case of fire moving across that landscape.
Yeah, great. That's helpful. That makes sense. When you said buffer, I thought it meant like an isolating buffer, but you mean more actually an integrated buffer to the rest of the region. So
Exactly.
thanks.
Yeah. Okay. And so just taking a quick look at some of the data that's being incorporated into that modeling. This is the 2021 LiDAR, which we acquired at the beginning of March. And so this has been uploaded into our data management system for the Elliott. It's accessible by the people working on this project. And this is just a quick snapshot of some of the information that we can see already from the LiDAR data. So this is looking at detecting change between the 2008 LiDAR and the 2021 imagery that we just gotten access to. And so this supports the FMP work with information on some additional details on stand history, as well as current conditions on the forest. And so you can see here in the key, the value is high change, in vegetation versus the blue, where everything has been harvested or otherwise disturbed since 2008. And so this information will be useful to improve our assessment of designated endangered species habitat conditions with current information, as well as application of the experimental design. And one other thing just wanted to point out quickly is you can see here individual blue dots, which represent individual trees and sort of the fine scale of analysis that we'll be able to do with this LiDAR data. Another update on efforts for data collection, and this also relates to the monitoring plan. We've been working on bringing together researchers, students, and field technicians for a 2022 field season and data collection towards the FMP. And so planning is in progress for work on targeted forest inventory. Some of the areas that we're looking at are more accurate data on tree age, stand age, structural characteristics for habitat, and understory vegetation in specific focal areas of the forest. And we are currently hiring field techs and students for this piece. We are also working with James Johnston, Andrew Marshall, and Matt Riley on a study on disturbance history and stand age. And they've outlined a multi-phase study, the first 2 phases of which would apply directly to the forest management plan, with additional phases really helping to support the early research happening on the Elliott and sort of building off this initial work. And so the first phase is sampling and a coarse grain fire history analysis and data collection using stump cross sections with an analysis of age cohorts and fire scars. And this actually lines up really well with the modeling that Neil and Melissa are doing in Landis and that buffer. So in this approach as well, with the data collection they're going to be doing this year, they have a grid that covers the Elliott, but also looks beyond the borders of the Elliott. So the modeling and the field studies line up there to look at the regional fire history, and then be able to look at projections for what we might expect in the future, particularly in different climate scenarios. The phase 2 here is a preliminary age structure study using tree coring with cross dating and measuring samples. And this is just focusing on the Elliott. So it's sort of a subset grid laid into the overall grid on the fire history. And so we're working with them on this. They're going to be doing that work this year, and then writing up their analysis as part of the forest management plan. We're also exploring additional opportunities, including integration between the terrestrial data collection and aquatic and riparian data and monitoring, working very closely with Gordy Reeves and Dana Warren on that. And we've also been in discussions with Jared Laboldis on data collection related to microbial communities, both soil microbial communities and canopy. Another area that we are planning around is an extensive biodiversity sampling design. And so this sampling design you see right here, we're looking at as serving for a template for broad scale biodiversity monitoring. We will be able to get preliminary data on variability from a similar plot design on the H.J. Andrews that will feed into the FMP on our timeline. And we are also looking at installation of plots across a range of forest ages in the Coast Range next summer as part of a federally funded grant. So we're currently coordinating with Matt Betts and Tal Levy about applying this work on the Elliott, including lessons learned on the H.J. Andrews that would support the development of the Elliott monitoring plan. So this image shows a schematic from their work and that federally funded grant that I mentioned. So this is what we are looking at applying on the Elliott. And it shows the design of these biodiversity plots. So you can see rings here with a variety of sampling pieces integrated in. And so the center of each sampling site contains game cameras. You can see a snapshot here, a malaise trap to collect flying insects, pitfall traps with which will sample ground dwelling arthropods. There will be soil cores taken. There will be plant surveys at 3 meters out from the center here. 20 meters out from the center, 3 meter vegetation plots, and then avian point counts as well around each of these plots. So it's really looking at how can we align these biodiversity sampling plots on the Elliott and collect data about this broad range of organisms across the forest. And so this is something that we're really excited about applying to the Elliott as well. And then looking at updates on the financial analysis. So as I mentioned in the beginning, we have a financial analysis working group consisting of members of the advisory committee, OSU and DSL. And we've been meeting throughout the past couple of months and having a step-by-step discussion and feedback on several pieces of the financial analysis, including the categories and values in the current Elliott State Research Forest draft annual budget, the projected expenses for the first 20 years, harvest and silvicultural costs that were used in the modeling that was done during the research proposal, as well as projected revenues, harvest modeling, growth and yield projections, and model assumptions. And so this group has identified additional factors to consider in the budget estimates, which we are using to update projected costs and revenues and help target the sensitivity analysis. The group has identified questions and areas for a closer look on the harvest models and projections, and we're working on digging into the numbers together. We'll be sharing additional information with that group to help update the analysis and do that sensitivity analysis. And so this is something that we're working through step by step, addressing questions, areas we need to go back and take a closer look at, and then continuing to apply a sensitivity analysis going forward as we continue to make these changes. We are also collaborating with DSL on information for the startup funds as well. And so there's sort of a two-pronged approach going on as part of the financial analysis. And then finally, I think we'll have time for questions, but just wanted to end with some information about the H.J. Andrews April meeting. And so members of the FMP working group and the broader advisory committee are being invited to the H.J. Andrews April meeting. These are monthly meetings that are used to share science, news, opportunities related to the experimental forest. And so this is sort of an opportunity to be a part of the conversation on an existing experimental forest that we are involved with very closely through these meetings and attending the lectures. The meetings start with a science hour. The April meeting is currently planned to focus on microbiome research for the first hour. And so they have 2 speakers lined up, with the second hour being a community meeting to share publications, introduce new members, and updates from partners, students, and on their education and outreach program. So if this is something that's of interest to any of the advisory committees on this call, we'd be happy to forward that meeting invite. It'll come out the week of the meeting, but that'll be the first Friday in April from 9 to 11.
And Shannon, that would be sort of in the spirit of both interest, somebody who might be interested in this particular area of research, but also to get a sense, sort of a flavor of sort of how that research forest is interfacing with the public and sharing information, et cetera.
Yes, exactly.
Great.
Thanks for clarifying that, Peter.
And Craig and Sue and Craig, I see you both have questions and interest. I think it'll be familiar to you, but we've kept conversation during these work group meetings and advisory committee meetings focused on committee members and those engaged in that committee work. We'll put you both down for public comment, and also see if there's an opportunity to address questions as we go and as time allows. So appreciate your willingness and to be here, your engagement and interest, and we'll make sure to save some time for you at the end. That said, Shannon, you had raised a question. So Paul, I see your hand, and then Tom has joined us. So if you wanted to repose that earlier question, I think it's time. So let's go. Before we do that, we'll go Paul Beck and then Mark Stern.
Well, the question is, and it was posed in chat, is there going to be a financial analysis of the benefit to the communities? That seems like that would be a good question to ask the economists, not the School of Forestry, but the I don't know, the business school or whoever would be best to ask that question. But it sure seems like it would be an opportunity. I know industry throws out numbers of the benefit of cutting 1 million board feet. Maybe this would be a good time to zero in on that number.
Yeah, Shannon, do you want me to answer that a little bit?
Sure, that'd be great, Randy.
Yeah, so Paul, I am an economist in the College of Forestry, and I do work on economic impact analysis, cost benefits, trying to estimate the values that people have on nature and natural systems, ecosystem delivery. All of these will be research topics under the social / recreation area. So we had that plan for, we've got the 4 focal areas where we've got the ecological stuff. And then on the social and recreation dimensions, we'll be looking into the economics, cost benefits, and valuation models there. So yes, we're working.
Are you looking at it strictly as a recreation question?
No.
Okay.
No. So the social part of this is going to understand what is the public's value of biodiversity, what are the trade-offs associated with the different techniques through aesthetic preferences and other things, as well as understanding the economic impacts and flow of money that comes in the local community, the value of education, and all of those different types of things. So we will be tracking, the jobs and income associated with timber management, but also more broadly the forest management and research side. So it's not broken out, but that's what we mean by the social component.
Okay, thanks.
Yep.
Thanks, Randy. Thanks, Paul, for the question, and Craig also for the question. Mark.
Yeah, hi. Hey, Shannon, I had 3 sort of quick questions. One, I just wondered, you mentioned the fire history study that James Johnson, Andrew, and Matt are going to work on. I just wondered sort of what's the length of that study? Is that a 1 field season study? Is that a 3-year study, or just sort of scale on when you think what's the duration of that effort? Because it seems pretty important to informing a lot of the modeling efforts.
Yeah, that's a great question. So they've put together a study proposal that is multiple phases, up to 4 or 5, I believe. The first 2 would happen during the timeline of the forest management plan development. So that would start this spring, and they would have analysis results able to be written up for the forest management plan. And then that early stage also serves as sort of a higher level view of what's happening across the region in the forest, so that they can see, based on their initial study results, where they might need to go next to do a bit of a deeper dive. And so that's where the other phases build on the first 2 phases, looking at fire history and stand age. And those would happen beyond the timeline of the forest management plan, but would align with the first few years of the Elliott State Research Forest being up and running.
Great, thanks. The other question, you mentioned the financial analysis is sort of looking at the first 20 years. I just wondered sort of what proportion of that 20 years are the plantations in the reserves, or how that part of it is, what component of that makes up that modeling, because that had been at least previously identified as an area that would potentially go to first.
Yeah, so the modeling that has been done to date by Mason, Bruce, and Gerard looked at a variety of different scenarios, and that early implementation of what would happen where and when as part of the experimental design, that is going to be part of that Triad experimental group. And so that's where some of those final decisions about the first years of the Elliott, I believe, would happen in concert with some of the harvest modeling and the harvest scheduling. So during this process, John Sessions has a harvest scheduling model that was used to optimize an even flow of wood across the years, and optimize sort of the volume of that wood across the different treatment types. And so that's something that work had been done during the research proposal. And now with the financial analysis group, we're digging into the assumptions that are built into that model, looking at areas where we need to conduct more of a sensitivity analysis and take a closer look, as well as working with the Triad experimental design group and the landscape modeling group to sort of bring all of these pieces together and determine what that will look like for the first 20 years, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I guess so. It sounds like sort of a work in progress to be determined is a little bit what I'm hearing, I think.
We have a foundation that we're building off of, but yes, this is the stage where we're digging into all of those details together with the working groups.
Then the last question I had is, you have the Elliott Science Advisory Committee. I'm just wondering if they've seen this presentation, if they've, had a role in helping develop it, or what's their role in this so far?
Do you mean the Research Forest Managers and Directors Committee, or?
Well, I'm thinking, I thought there was sort of a science committee that's chaired by, I forget her name, but a woman at Portland State University. You had.
Yes. Yes, the science advisory panel that was part of the research proposal. We have been reaching out to members of that group individually, but they have not seen this specific presentation. And so we are continuing to reach out to them and think about ways that we might be able to bring them into this process, if that's appropriate. Katie, I don't know if you have any other thoughts, because you worked very closely with that group on the research proposal.
Well, that group was really there for the research proposal, and we've entered a more tactical phase now. So they were more in the theoretical underpinnings and the overall proposal. And so we haven't engaged them, like Shannon said, as a group, but we are going back to individuals and asking them specific questions about whether it's public input methodologies. We've talked to several of them about that. And also we've reached out to Linda Nagel about the climate change and forestry work that Shannon presented earlier too. So definitely engaging the individuals, but not as a whole group. We've kind of feel like the science has already been vetted, and we really want to work on the implementation now.
Okay, thanks.
Thanks. So we take a couple more questions and then we'll have Gordy and Dana join for their presentation on riparian stuff. So Bob and then Ken.
Hi, Shannon. Thanks for this presentation. It's really helpful. Two things we talked about when we spoke on the phone, but I wanted to flag them here too, that I think would be really helpful in the wildlife group and the subgroups, would be to consider having a marten working group and a stream dwelling amphibian group. I think there's a lot of interest in martens as a listed species that isn't included in the HCP, so it needs some special attention. And stream dwelling amphibians, just because I think it's a way of really getting a sense of what's happening in those higher reaches and how biodiversity is being affected one way or another. So I was wondering what your thoughts were on those. I know we've had a little bit of a chance to discuss that, but if you have any further thoughts there.
Yeah, and that's something that after our discussion, I brought that back to our team at OSU. So I know you had some thoughts on some possible names of people we could connect with on those. So yes, our plan is to continue that discussion and follow up.
Great, thank you.
I can just fill in too with some of that. We've started discussions with Tiffany Garcia, and particularly around the amphibian side. And I think Gordy and Dana may talk about that some. And also that plot structure that Shannon showed, one of the things that was discussed about that as well was to get a better handle of, if there are martens on the Elliott. And so there was discussion around that tall levee, I don't know if you know tall, that was particularly in respect to being able to, explore and answer that question about the potential extent and frequency. So that also is part of our ongoing discussions with the wildlife biologists and with the, so.
Great, thank you.
Thanks, Ken. Or yeah, Ken, go ahead.
Yeah, Ken, I'm here, Peter. One comment that, directly here about the wildlife. It would, I would like to see us also in that realm of discussing wildlife, talking about the predator species and large ungulate species across the landscape through time, about kind of what happens. And my interest in that was piqued by reading the letter from Matt and Jerry that Tom sent around, I think yesterday. I see some great opportunities there for some of our megafauna there to have some attention to. But the reason I raised my hand was a follow-up question on the economics of what Randy told us. I'm not sure how to frame the question, but it's a recreation and social kind of question about the economics. And it goes to kind of the current recreation and social activities on the forest are more or less the traditional type. In other words, hunting and fishing, and just folks cruising around and enjoying the forest on the road system. And I know or at least I think I know, sounds like the timeline on the initial economic study is probably about the same timeline as kind of some of our initial within this 20-year period that Shannon's alluded to a couple times. And I wonder how an economic model might look specific to the recreation and economic impacts on the community at sort of this traditional kind of use, which there are some numbers on, economics related to hunting and fishing in local communities. There's some pretty good information around on that, but I'm scratching my head about how over time and within this 20-year, we probably will get there. Some of the recreation is expanded more to kind of the mountain biking, maybe some hiking trail constructions, and how we might track that. That was the long-winded question.
Yeah, and that's what we've been thinking about too, Ken, is we've got to get a handle on what the current demand is, and then we've got to look at latent demand and other opportunities as we move over time. And while we aren't looking at, some of this is going to deal with the authority is going to have control over some of what's going to happen there. As far as access and permissible activities. But yeah, as trails and educational trails and other adventure type activities open up, that's why we want to have the baseline information, but also with our startup funds to get some tracking cameras out there and sensors and stuff to understand where people are going and why. So that we can flow them in the right direction and bring them into areas where they can learn and really benefit from that. We recently, with Ian Munanura, who's recreation faculty here in the college, just finished a feasibility study with Whiskey Run mountain biking area that's just near there. And so we're looking at opportunities of being able to feed off of that. Feed off of activities for Loon Lake Campground and other types of opportunities, probably more in the past, so to speak. All right.
Thanks, Ken. Thanks, Randy. And Tom, are you in a position to come on camera or? Thanks. Ken mentioned briefly the letter from Jerry and Matt, and Shannon had referenced it earlier. You sent a message along with that distribution yesterday, and I wondered if you wanted to just touch briefly on that before we turn our attention to Gordy and Dana.
Yeah, thanks, Peter. And sorry, apologies to everyone for being late. I had a board meeting that ran late, and nice to see you all this afternoon. Anyhow, that letter, I think, one of the key things about that letter were, number one, just the fact that Jerry was engaging on the Elliott and that was a follow-up to, we had the climate adapted silviculture meeting, which was a virtual meeting with Linda Nagel and other members of that network. And Jerry had been part of that and expressed not only interest in working together on an application as such at the Elliott, but also just acknowledged that that could be done within the framework, the research framework that had been proposed. And so this was it was kind of a big shift in the dialogue that had been going on between some of the OSU faculty and Jerry, and so I simply asked Jerry and Matt to start looking at and working on some ideas about implementation of work that could be nested within that research framework, the Triad framework, and this is what they came up with as a first cut. And so for me, the really exciting part of it is that there is a lot of flexibility within the framework that can accommodate nested studies, and B, that they were thinking together of ways to approach this and how to best, starting to think about that notion of how do we get work off the ground on the Elliott? What's that look like? Where do we focus our attention at first? How do we lay this out with the sub-watersheds and instrumentation of sub-watersheds? And so I shared it with you all as just an example. It's one, something where we can use this as a jumping off point for further discussion of that very thing, the climate adapted silviculture, as well as implementation of studies within that design. So, and of course, with Jerry working with us on that effort. So.
Thanks, Tom.
Yeah. And so,
Great.
Yeah, go ahead.
Oh, no, I was going to move us. Do you have anything else you wanted to share?
No, that's fine. Thanks, Peter.
Yeah, thank you, Tom. Gordy and Dana, why don't we have the two of you join us now?
Okay. You want to give me the ability to share screens?
You got it.
Okay. Let's see. Okay, that working?
We got you.
Okay, great. Okay, well, haven't seen a lot of these people in a long time. Hello. I've been working with Dana Warren the last month or so on trying to jumpstart the aquatic section of the FMP. And what we're going to do is just talk about some of the things that we put together here and begin just a review of the HCP and where we started and how that's going to lead into what we think is going to be the foundation for the FMP. And so remember the purpose of, one of the objectives in the HCP was to focus on ecological processes and maintaining those for the recovery of the aquatic organism. And just as a reminder how unique the Elliott is in the sense of or relative to ESA, the Elliott, probably like no other place in the Oregon coast, is the nexus of 3 of the independent populations within the ESU that's listed for Oregon Coast Coho. So in the sense of responsibility for contributing to the recovery of the ESU, there's probably no other place in the coast, in the Oregon coast, that has a bigger potential as the Elliott. Okay, because like I say, it's the nexus of 3 of these independent populations, which are the foundation for the recovery of the ESU. So here, these are the broad topics, areas that Dana and I have identified for research, aquatic research. And what I'm going to do is really focus on the first one and then show how the other one can lead into it. Remember, this is the design of the Elliott with the conservation research watershed there, the reserves, and then the management research watershed, which are a combination of intensive, extensive, and smaller reserve. So it's in this context that the research will take place. And there's within given watershed, within the management research watershed, the MRW, remember that I think there's like roughly 120 or so different sub-watersheds, and they all have different assignments of, depending on assignments of land allocation, depending on the category of the triad that they're put into. So it's a very complex landscape when you start to look at it from a research perspective, but it provides ample opportunity for replication. And like I just shown you, that's how things can vary. That you saw an extensive, here's an intensive. There's hatched areas where stand areas are greater than 65, and the overlapping areas are where the marble mulettes and owls are, designations are. Okay. So what's also unique about the Elliott is in terms of its streams. First of all, because of that steep, highly dissected topography, it has a disproportionate number of stream miles per unit of area, okay? And it's a combination of fish-bearing streams, which are the dark blue, and there's roughly about 260 miles, okay? Now also keep in mind that under the previous management regime of ODFW, this is roughly 30% higher in terms of what we've classified as fish-bearing streams because we're using different criteria. And then the vast majority of the streams, in fact, this is probably, this ratio of about 10-to-1 or 9-to-1 in terms of stream, fish-bearing to non-fish-bearing streams is quite high. But there's almost 2,000 miles of non-fish-bearing streams that we've identified in the Elliott. And again, it's really unique. But what it also means is there's really, the opportunities for doing integrated research between the terrestrial and the aquatic realm are just rich in this landscape. And it's something we should really be trying to take advantage of. Now, the focus on the ecological processes, we use this diagram from the development of the Northwest Forest Plan and the distance from the channel that various processes take place. And the idea is to maintain these processes across the landscape. We're using wood as a surrogate because the wood recruitment occurs furthest from the channel. So we're using that as a proxy for how well the conditions of how well we're doing with regard to maintaining ecological processes. And we look at this in terms of different sources of wood. The fish-bearing streams are contributing roughly 60%, 62% of the wood. The non-fish-bearing streams, this is a rather high proportion of wood, but again, it fits with that highly topographic nature of the Elliott, about 38% of the wood. So we've got two major sources of wood, these non-fish-bearing and fish-bearing streams. We've gone through an analysis process. I'm sorry I'm going pretty quickly, but I feel like we're crunched for time. We're trying to give you some background here. We've identified the non-fish-bearing streams that have the highest priority of delivery to the fish-bearing stream, the fish-bearing portions of the network. This is this work has got a strong foundation from a wealth of other studies that have been done both in the Coast Range and elsewhere, showing how well these models work in terms of identifying it. So we've identified these particular streams, these particular non-fish-bearing streams across the landscape. And we've set up different riparian designations have been established. So in the reserve, the CRW and the reserve, which include the MRW, there's essentially 200 feet on the side of every stream is the riparian management areas. In the MRW, along the fish-bearing stream, that ranges from 120 to 200 feet, depending on the designation. The perennial non-fish-bearing streams the same. The debris flow torrents you see is from 50 to 200. So there's varying designation depending on where you are in the Elliott. Now, one of the key things, and I think, and one of the more, I think, anticipated elements of the research program that's going to come from the Elliott and probably early on because of the need for restoration of these riparian areas, is we have secured agreement with National Marine Fisheries Service that we won't be held to this type of standard, where there's usually it can be from anywhere from 100 to 120, maybe 150 feet on each side of a stream. Is generally off limit to any management. Okay. Now we argued during the development of the HCP that there are key processes that occur within that zone, and in terms of litter fall, root strength, but also one of the key ones is the development of the largest trees on the landscape tend to be in that zone close to the stream. And we have actually truncated or compromised the ecological integrity, I would argue, of riparian areas by not allowing activity to occur throughout it and restricting it to that outer zone. You've retarded those processes in that inner zone by restricting management. So we are going to have the ability to go out and actually do active management in riparian areas where it's deemed necessary. And so one of the early research programs will be in terms of identifying riparian areas that are overstocked in terms of conifers. They lack the deciduous input, a list of other features. There'll be an analysis done using the LiDAR to begin to identify these areas where we think restoration should occur. And again, there'll be the emphasis on the conservation research watershed areas, but there'll be other parts of the Elliott as well. And then we're also going to be able to look at trade-offs in terms of the ecological effectiveness of trading off the width of the fish-bearing streams against the non-fish-bearing streams, and doing some, I think, really unique and novel research on different designs rather than a one-size-fits-all. We'll begin to think about alternatives to that may provide, we can look at it from both the economic side and the ecological side in terms of the consequences. And because of that highly dissected nature and the extensive nature of those non-fish bearing streams, as I pointed out, there is just a tremendous opportunity for much more integrated research between the terrestrial and the aquatic sciences disciplines, I think, than anywhere else, that where a research forest has been established. And this is something that I think should be front and center in terms of highlighting what's going to happen on the Elliott. And this is not just, Bob Salinger asked about the aquatic and the amphibians. This is if you want to look for the biodiversity hotspots, these headwater streams is where it's at, both in terms of the amphibians and invertebrates, but these are key areas many times for providing habitat for both owls and murrelets. And so we've got this landscape that is tightly integrated, and I think, again, we need to take advantage of that as we develop these programs. One of the key things that'll come out of this is also the interest in landslides and instability. And one of the key parts of the restoration effort, I think, will be how does the nature of landslide change as a result of having larger trees in these headwater streams? There's been some initial work that's been done that shows that the behavior of the landslide and the response of the stream is very different when you have large wood entrained in it, which you see in that picture in the upper left, as opposed to just having where you lack wood in it. And so the Elliott will be a real, be really rich in opportunities to delve into this question. And you marry this with the restoration effort where you're trying to get the big trees back, and then we look to the future, and we can begin to get a handle on what both the ecological, primarily what the ecological effect of these landslides, not just looking at it in terms of a negative, but the potential benefits of it. Okay, and this work is going to occur I said earlier on, it's going to be in the CRW there, that big part of that western portion of the forest, but also early work will be focused in the Millicoma River and the West Fork of the Millicoma. And we're going to look really strongly here to partner with for many of much of this work, partner with the Coast Watershed Council and try to integrate them and their efforts into restoration. So I'm going to turn it over to Dana, and he's going to talk about the in-stream portion.
Thanks, Gordy. So for those who don't know me, I'm relatively new to this team. I think I'm an aquatic ecologist. I'm in the Department of Forest Ecosystems and Society. I'm a faculty member there. And I do a lot of my research on forest stream interactions and how what we do in the riparian zone and what that forest looks like and how that might affect in-stream processes and in-stream biota. And in particular, I want to talk about is some ideas we've had for specific in-stream restoration. And I also want to reiterate some of Gordy's points about the uniqueness of the Elliott in the size and our capacity it really allows us to ask questions we kind of can't ask in most other environments. And the time frame is also really important. I think a lot of stream restoration work looks at what happens if we monitor it all, we just look at what happens a couple of years later. And we know that streams, like forests, right, it takes a long time for them to evolve and develop. And so I think the long-term perspective that the Elliott brings is really quite unique. So, all right, Gordy, I'm going to have Gordy move my slides for me. All right, next slide. So we have, again, reaches with really high intrinsic potential for coho. This is obviously a species of concern in coastal Oregon. And again, as Gordy mentioned, we have links to 3 different ESUs within this section. And we can also see areas where there's particularly high intrinsic potential and areas where it's a little bit lower. The Mellicoma, again, is where I think a lot of our effort would be well served to put a lot of effort there, at least initially. Next slide, Gordy.
Hang on, I'm having trouble advancing it for some reason.
So I'm going to talk explicitly here about 2 ideas around wood additions to streams. And again, this is a place where there's a great deal of potential to collaborate with watershed groups. I'm going to focus here just on wood addition, some ideas about how we can move the sort of the science of restoration and wood addition forward, looking at wood additions on a stream network, and then also some ideas about how we can do it on a floodplain. As Gordy mentioned, there's also natural wood recruitment events, but in the interest of time, we're not going to unpack those. So go ahead, Gordy. So people have been adding wood to streams for quite a while. It's a really widely used restoration tool, but there remain a number of key questions that aren't really well developed. And some of the ones here may be familiar to some of you, right? So are the effects of wood localized? So how important is one piece of wood versus multiple pieces of wood versus multiple jams of wood along a stream? Are there aggregate effects? And essentially, how much wood do we need to have a whole stream effect? If we just add 1 or 2 pieces of wood, what do we expect in terms of a population level effect versus adding lots of wood? And so one of the things that, again, we have the capacity to do with the density of streams and the amount of habitat at the Elliott is to try to unpack this. So next slide, Gordy. So essentially, we can ask this question of how do wood jam effects scale up, and explicitly in this restoration context. Next slide. So I'm going to take you through just this conceptual idea development where we have essentially distance along a stream, or this could be, you can think of replicate streams with different numbers of pieces of wood. And then we have our biological response metric X. And there's a number of different aspects of the stream ecosystem that we could look at, or stream biota. You can think of this in terms of maybe some sort of fish response. That's certainly where a lot of the focus is. All right, so go ahead, Gordy, next slide. So we can have localized effects. So if a piece of wood has a small localized effect, it has this influence, but then it essentially drops back down and we don't see any sort of aggregate effect. Next slide. Or we could end up having some sort of additive effect. So as we add more wood to the stream, we see an additive additional impact of wood or benefit of wood as we add more to the system. Next slide. Or we could see where there are specific places where a given piece of wood may have a lot of effect, but other wood doesn't seem to have a strong influence. Or last slide, or next slide. This next example is you may see where we have some sort of threshold effect, right? So in a lot of ecosystems, sort of, you can think of tipping points. So you have a little bit more habitat, and then you pass some sort of threshold where your, let's say your carrying capacity or your response metric goes up a lot. So these are essentially 3 different alternative hypotheses for how our biological response metric, let's say fish, might respond to wood additions, and understanding whether it's valuable to have 1 or 2 pieces or 4 or 5 pieces, or if you need 30 pieces or 50 pieces before you have an effect, I think is a really interesting and important question as we think about sort of broadly across the Pacific Northwest, implementing wood addition efforts. So next slide. And then I think, again, I highlighted this at the beginning, but the long-term nature of the Elliott is, I think, really unique and allows us to ask these questions about persistence over time. So we have this wood addition. Do we see it as sort of as a short response, some sort of acute response? Does it persist for a long time? And then we can build into this, as Gordy mentioned, this idea of what are we doing in the riparian zone that may be accelerating the development of large wood that could recruit naturally. So we really see this wood addition as first step that's then going to push us further along. Next slide.
Wait, excuse me, Peter, I see Paul has his hand up. Do we want to?
Yeah, why, Paul, did you have a question?
I did, if I can get my unmute to work. You've got the three options there, but I can think of a fourth. At what point is there too much wood? And that's a question that I've asked a couple of fish biologists, and I've never really gotten an answer that satisfied me. But you know, you've got diminishing returns, but at some point I would think it would be harmful to the system.
I think it probably depends on how you're terming harm. So, for example, in the recent fire, we were looking at some areas in the Cascades where we had a lot of wood come down, and the wood itself actually shaded the stream. So even though the canopy was open, the stream was really shaded. And so we didn't see in that particular, it was a different study, but we didn't see a primary production response. So you can have a situation where you have so much wood added to your stream, you're actually adding additional shade to the stream and reducing some of your in-stream production. In the context of restoration, I think that's pretty rare that happens. I think one it's certainly possible. I think it's more an issue though of diminishing returns and trying to find a point of diminishing returns, but it's certainly conceivable that you could have, quote, too much wood. I think, and I'll let Gordy jump in on this. I think another key thing to think about is the time influence. And that, you know, it may be that initially there is a lot of wood. So I think a good example is something like a natural landslide that dumps a ton of wood and sediment into one specific spot in the stream. And that spot may be degraded. It may be poor habitat for fish for a time, but 10 years from then, 20 years from then, after the wood is redistributed, you may end up having that area be particularly productive. And so I think the time scale becomes a really important consideration when we think about good versus bad. So I don't know if that actually answers your question. I'll let you respond.
Actually, I wasn't so much looking for an answer. I was looking for the question to be asked. That don't rule that out as a possibility that there can be too much wood, and we should look at that. We should look at that, you know, initially and over time, that maybe there can be too much and it is actually harmful.
Yeah, I think that's a good point, and that's certainly, I will build that into the conceptual model in the previous piece, because I think that's where you're going, is I need to acknowledge that there are other alternatives. Yeah.
Thanks, Dana and Paul and Gordy. I don't think you need to respond on this piece. Maybe we'll let Dana keep going and with an eye towards the clock.
Okay.
All right. Yeah, you can. Yeah. So the other piece I just wanted to bring up briefly was moving outside of the higher gradient streams, but that I think there's a lot of potential with wood addition to strategically place wood such that we can help re-engage floodplains. In a lot of our coastal systems, the historic management in those systems has downcut streams and really disconnected them from floodplains. And so I think that there's a lot that we could do if we think about wood addition beyond the sort of classic idea of adding wood to help create pool habitat and things like that. But the idea of putting wood in a specific way to try to drive wood into floodplains. And I bring this up especially because floodplains are really important refuge habitat for juvenile salmonids, especially in winter in a lot of these coastal systems. And they're particularly important. This is just an example. So this is a much smaller stream, but this is an example from a study that people did where they did an experimental wood addition and showed how adding wood to the stream essentially decreases velocities and drives wood into the floodplain. So next slide. And this is just an example of a LiDAR image from NetMap of Elliott Creek. So it's not our site, but this gives an example of the kind of thing we could do if we can get some LiDAR images of the ground to think about where we might be able to strategically place wood in the stream to divert water into historic floodplain channels or into the floodplain in a more effective way. And so I think wood could be a really important tool in floodplain landscapes in order to try to help reconnect. Next slide. And I just want to highlight that again. I think for practical purposes, we'd want to start focusing on this region here in terms of an optimal place to begin to do some of these specific wood additions, where we could work with the watershed councils as well.
Yeah.
Next slide. I think kicking it back to you here, Gordy.
Yeah, well, no, and then all of this is part and parcel to the whole idea of beaver reintroduction and restoration, and that'll be a major focus of this of the research, particularly as we do the combination of the reconnecting floodplains and the restoration. There'll be plenty of opportunity to look into beaver reintroductions here. Okay, just real quick, one of the things that's been come up, and Katie's mentioned this a couple times to us, is there's interest in what is the effect of the Elliott off outside the boundaries of the Elliott, particularly with regard to water issues. And so initially there'll be a focus on water quality and public quantity that's being exported from the Elliott into the 3 independent populations. And I think that can quickly blossom into include a whole bunch of other attributes, and the transport of wood, invertebrates, a whole other things, life history diversity. So there'll be plenty of opportunity to build a program that begins to look at sort of how the Elliott, or the effect of the Elliott, are transported across this landscape, and how does it affect these populations.
Gordy,
yeah,
just because it's on a very similar topic, noting Ken's question about potential influences of large wood downstream and impacts to infrastructure and sort of human populations, as well as their potential for that.
Oh yes, I mean that again, I think what we need to be thinking of is that we'll be doing, there'll be a focus on this idea of restoration and trying to get trees, big wooden stuff back. But then we need to look at sort of how that signal gets transmitted across the landscape. And initially it'll probably be more in terms of the water quality, but I think we need to build into the fact that there may be other things happen down the road, and we should be doing monitoring or have research programs to begin to be able to document that. So we're trying to lay, this may be not, it's something, it may start in one form, but it has potential to really expand as the Elliott matures. Okay, and just real quick on climate change, there's the other aspect of this. If you look at the downscale climate change projection, there are certain parts of the Elliott that are likely to see increased water temperatures, but for the vast majority, it's not likely to happen. And I'm going the wrong way here. There's some stream reaches where riparian vegetation is going to be important in terms of controlling water temperature, but the big signal of climate change on the Elliott is going to be increased winter flows. And that's likely to lead to more, a greater incidence of landslides and debris flows. And so just focus on restoring vegetation in these headwater streams, getting trees back and understanding how these things happen is really going to be critical as we move forward to help us understand and potentially begin to develop mitigation for climate change. Okay, things that are going to additional focus is a thing about the size and composition, like I said, and it's going to of the RMAs and how they're going to influence water quantity and quality both on the Elliott and off of it. There's certainly going to be opportunities to look at human interactions with riparian areas and potential both from an economic, social aspect, but also from an ecological perspective. And again, given the extensive nature of riparian areas in the Elliott, this seems like a right place to do this type of stuff. And then carbon. There's been a lot of focus recently on the storage of wood, particularly storage of wood in these headwater streams. And it seems like the Elliott, again, is the perfect place to begin to expand that type of research and focus on carbon storage. So Dana, I'm going to let you take it from here.
Okay, and Dana, as you do that, just keep an eye on the clock. We're running just a little late, so moving as efficiently. I want to see if there are any questions also before we let you go. And then I know, Matt, we got to get to you as well, and want to be mindful of your availability. So go ahead, Dana.
All right. Thanks. Sorry, my internet just cut out there for a second, but I'm back. Can everybody hear me and stuff?
Yeah.
Okay, so I'll try to be quick here. The gist of it is that we're trying to think of an organizational plan where we can maximize input from people while also minimizing the demand we ask of them in terms of time that they need to attend meetings. And so this was sort of the framework we thought of, is that we'd sort of have a core steering committee with myself and Gordy, a few stakeholders. These are just examples, nothing is set. And then additional fish or forest or wildlife person from the Elliott State Forest Research Team as sort of a core committee. And then we would have a set of steering committee expert members. So we would have hydrologists, ecosystem biogeochemists, fish ecologists, watershed council. You can read the list. This is not an exhaustive list. Again, this is just an example of some of what we came up with. And the idea would be that when we had specific research questions, go ahead, Gordy, we would pull in steering committee expert and stakeholder members to help inform those decisions. And so when we had these meetings to try to plan decisions, we might not necessarily need everybody on the team, but we would pull in some of the core members to help make those decisions. So I have a couple of quick examples. So Gordy, next slide. So if we're let's say asking a question about where do we want to put the weirs in this study, we would have a meeting that would pull in the core team plus the hydrologists, ecosystem ecologists and biogeochemists, geotechnical engineers and silviculturists, maybe. And then if we were to ask then the question about, let's say the riparian buffers, many people have opinions on this, but rather than try to have a totally unruly meeting, we would again have the core plus a series of stakeholders and experts who would be able to provide more specific input on those configurations. And then next slide. Or if we were thinking about, let's say, the wood additions, we would have another set of the stakeholders and experts who would weigh in on that. So this is at least conceptually how we were thinking about laying out the organization, because we want to be able to leverage the expertise and make sure we have input from all the stakeholders, but we recognize you can't have meetings of 20 people all the time. And so this was our thought of how we can move forward. And to Bob's point about the salamanders, this is again a place where we would explicitly be bringing in wildlife ecologists. It wouldn't just be a team of aquatic ecologists doing this. We'd be trying to really pull in other folks. So sorry, I went through that kind of fast, but there you go.
No, I appreciate it, Dana. And then maybe if you all want to stop sharing, Brett, we'll take your question, and then Matt will go to you. Brett?
Okay. Hey, Gordy. Hey, Dana. And it's good to see everybody again. I know it's been a while. And so working for the Wild Salmon Center now and coming into this work group, I know I'm not, I want to be sensitive to like Wild Salmon Centers on the advisory committee, but showing up to this kind of work group, I think for the first time, but having tracked the aquatic strategy and different iterations over time and kind of knowing how we got here and also being really excited about it. I think it was great to hear Gordy, you and Dana reflect on like the coolness factors of what the Elliott presents and the opportunities it allows. And it's really good to hear Oregon State kind of reflecting the excitement around that too. I feel like we're at this moment in time where it's a pretty cool place to be, where there's a new chapter on the Elliott. And one of the things I think about in that context is just what does the FMP part of this really need to do that hasn't been done already. And I felt like this was a really good overview of the kind of what the Elliott is going, a reminder of kind of how we got here and what the different management approaches and the sideboards and also how we got here. But also thinking about like the baseline, and I think a lot of what Shannon, you presented earlier around data that's being collected, LiDAR and others. I think one thing that stood out on the aquatic end is with both the peak flows, winter flows, and then the peak flows in the summertime, that issue and the role of climate change affecting that, also the role of different management rotations affecting that. The Elliott's, I think, really well set up to maybe expand on some of that flow research, the Perry and Jones, Segura stuff, and there's a connection back to the Andrews on that too. So getting that baseline data around flows in some of the areas that would be researched seems pretty important. And it felt like for the FMP, some of the things that I guess we're hoping it could do is start to set out, okay, where, in the same way we're thinking about some of the terrestrial stuff, where to go first on some of that kind of research, where to go first on the riparian thinnings, where you might want to set up some of that or some of that baseline data collection in advance to see what changes may happen as a result of thinnings. And then some of the things that weren't tied off earlier in the process where it felt like we got to a place and the next layer down was going to be, okay, let's settle some things at the FMP level. Those related to the steep slopes issue and kind of, especially in the intensives, and how the high landslide delivery potential, you know, where they were going to be allocated, what OSU would be doing in the steepest of the steep areas, and how to kind of take that to the next level, the overall approach, both in the intensives on steep slopes and then also in the extensive, where it seems like there's some balancing that needs to go on about how the 20 to 80% is going to be allocated or shifted depending on terrestrial concerns versus aquatic steep slope concerns. So that's the kind of stuff that I think I'm hoping to hear more about around how the FMP is going to do that, but also realizing, and I'm hoping the FMP will do that, but before next December. But I know I'm stepping into this not having been in the process a while, so I'm happy to take kind of the refresher offline if that helps with the meeting time or clock, Peter.
Well, can I just respond real quick? I mean, you've identified all of those thorny issues
Yeah.
that need to be brought into it. What we were trying to do here was just to sort of highlight the initial, you know, the initial research aspects of it. And certainly those things will have to be addressed to get the research off the ground.
If I could just also respond to that real quick, Peter, because I know we need to move on, but Brett, I think to echo Gordy, you know, the points that you bring up are really key to the forest management plan. And it is a part of that Triad experimental design working group, as well as the aquatic and riparian working groups. And we've been talking with Gordy and Dana about the appropriate maybe subgroups that would work on specifics. But as we are looking at the updated LiDAR data, as we're looking at the spatial analysis that we have, and we're bringing these groups together to work together to identify those locations with people who are working on the terrestrial side, with extensive and intensive and reserves, as well as the aquatic and riparian side. So you're absolutely right. And that is part of the target for this FMP, even though we didn't get into it today.
Okay, thanks, Shannon. Yeah, and Gordy too. So maybe it's just planting a flag, and I'm happy to show up and be part of that and kind of work with from the Wild Salmon Center end and the process end, if that's helpful to just figure out how to do that. But I think those are the things that I know organizationally we're still wanting to see the FMP do. And thanks. It's good to see everybody again.
Thanks, Brett.
Thanks, everyone.
All right, Matt, you're up. Thanks for your
right.
patience.
No problem. No problem at all. Thanks, everybody. As I'm pulling my slides up here, I thought I would thought I would really quickly just introduce myself to those of you who don't know me. My name is Matt Powers. I'm an assistant professor of silviculture here in the College of Forestry at OSU. I'm going to talk with you a little bit about kind of the framework of knowledge that we already have in place that could support the development of silvicultural approaches and important questions to look at within the extensive treatment areas on the Elliott State Research Forest. So just as a kind of background or reminder of the extensive treatment areas' broad goals, in general, in the context of things that are going to inform silvicultural thinking here, the keys are in these extensive treatment areas, we want to deliver a wide suite of ecosystem services while still providing some degree of commercial wood production in a both stand and landscape setting that provides diverse forest characteristics, so diversity of structure, successional stages, species composition, et cetera. So with that in mind, we can think about sort of what's in our silvicultural toolbox, and we have different harvesting methods. We can influence different levels of residual density, different spatial patterns of trees that are left versus harvested within stands, and variation of that across the sub-watershed scale within the Elliott, different opening sizes, and a number of other things. But what I'm going to focus on today are sort of that first few set of elements of silvicultural decision-making that I highlighted, which are the opportunities to look at alternative harvest methods, so the clear cutting that's historically been predominant in the coastal Douglas fir region, and then to look at the potential impacts of different residual density levels, so leaving different levels of tree density, different rotation lengths, different opening sizes, and different levels of or spatial patterns of legacy retention. So when we think about silvicultural approaches,
were you intending to share screen?
Oh yes, I'm sorry. Are you not seeing my screen?
We're not seeing your screen right now.
Thanks for letting me know. Let's try it again. Is that better?
We got you now.
Okay, perfect. Well, you missed 2 slides, so thank you for telling me. So when we think about kind of silvicultural approaches that have been suggested as methods to kind of marry some degree of commercial wood production with provisioning of a whole bunch of other ecosystem services, one that's commonly suggested and has some degree of research here in the Pacific Northwest are various forms of retention harvests. And the idea of retention harvest, which is kind of a big group of different silvicultural cutting methods, is essentially you are using a harvest as a mechanism to promote the establishment of a new age class, to promote the establishment of tree regeneration, but you are retaining, that's the retention piece, structural elements and biological legacies from the previous stand. And a lot of the existing research in retention harvest and a lot of the questions about kind of their applicability focus on sort of 2 things. One is the residual density level that you're going to leave, and the other is the spatial pattern of that retention or the spatial pattern of extraction. And in the context of spatial patterns of retention, we oftentimes differentiate between sort of 3 broad spatial patterns. We can have dispersed retention, which we see up here in the upper left, with trees more or less evenly distributed across the site. We can have more aggregated retention, where most of our retention is concentrated in unharvested leaf islands or patches within a harvest unit. And then we can have these sort of group-based or gap-based retention harvest systems, where the harvest is happening in these gaps. So this is an aerial photo looking down on one of these stands, and this is one of the gaps on ground level. And then you sort of have this matrix between those gaps that represents your retention. So those are kind of our 3 spatial patterns of retention that we look at in these retention harvest approaches: dispersed, aggregated, and gap-based. And this picture down on the right is sort of an operational example on the Coquel forest of that combines those patterns. So we have some dispersed retention in the foreground, some aggregated retention in a strip along this ephemeral stream here in the sort of center of the picture. And then, although it's kind of hard to see through that aggregate retention, there's a big open area behind that. So let's look at some of what we do know about the impacts of different retention levels and patterns. And one pretty obvious and straightforward thing is these are regeneration harvests. So primary objective is to regenerate a new age class that will be both your commercial wood production of the future and contribute to habitat and structure and things like that. And the higher our level of retention, so the higher our, in this case, basal area we leave, the slower that new age class, that new cohort we're establishing is going to grow. That's not a big surprise. But both level of retention and spatial pattern of retention have been shown to have some impact on rates of growth in that new age class we're establishing. So dispersed retention generally reduces understory tree growth more than aggregated retention or gap-based retention systems. And in contrast, though, dispersed retention tends to foster higher densities of natural regeneration because you have seed trees left throughout the unit, right, that can provide seed for new seedlings. And when we look at sort of different levels of retention, a lot of studies that are specifically looking at things like variable retention harvest system characterize level of retention based on the percentage of pre-harvest basal area that's left. So that's what these 5 to 15% numbers are talking about. If we leave 5 to 15% of that pre-harvest basal area, studies have shown that has pretty limited impacts on understory growth of Douglas fir. But as we start moving up to probably what are more operational retention levels for a extensive type treatment of 25 to 30% retention, that's where we start to see reductions in understory tree growth across a suite of species, but particularly in Douglas fir. And one of the important things is that those retention level effects on tree growth vary among species. So more shade tolerant species, less shade tolerant species like Douglas fir, there's probably a zone of residual density opportunity in which we can get little Douglas fir seedlings growing and keep them growing under some level of residual tree retention. And that zone of opportunity is probably a little lower in terms of residual density than the zone of opportunity to get species like more shade tolerant species like a Western hemlock or a Western red cedar. So there are opportunities to use different retention levels to promote the competitive success of different understory tree cohort species. Hey, and that was primarily contrasting these sort of aggregated versus dispersed retention. I also mentioned that sort of gap-based retention harvest systems are another option. We can see an example of that with pretty small gaps here and some Western hemlock coming up inside that gap. And there's a lot of research on the effects of different gap sizes on tree regeneration in the Pacific Northwest. Most of that research suggests if you're trying to regenerate Douglas fir, which is sort of your primary commercial wood species, gaps of half an acre or less, which is what a lot of these studies have put in, are really too small to create a competitive environment for Douglas fir regeneration. But as we can see in this picture, they do allow for recruitment of shade. Those smaller gaps do allow for recruitment of some shade tolerant species like the Western hemlock over here on the right. And this contributes to structural complexity in those stands, which is an important part of contributing to the both retention and the development of sort of late successional forest characteristics on the landscape.
Matt, we had a question from Paul Beck.
Oh yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, well, one of the questions that I would, and notice I'm saying one of the questions, not one of the answers I'm seeking. One of the questions I would seek would be what the effect of these different treatments have on the future value of the retention trees.
Yeah,
I've seen thinning projects on the BLM where it's really opened up, and the only way I can describe it is they're destroying the future value of those trees. It may produce murrelet habitat, maybe, but there's a trade-off, and it's always good to know what those trade-offs are.
Yeah, a little of that trade-off I'm going to get to in talking about risk of damage and particularly wind throw for those retention trees, which is a big issue with retention harvest systems. But some of those other value questions are good ones. And in terms of kind of wood products value, so commercial economic value of those residual trees, a lot of those thinnings, I'm guessing, on BLM land are probably in their LSR, their late successional reserve land use allocation, where
It's
they're not
everywhere.
really matrix lands too. Okay, but one of the rationales for, say, a heavier thinning is to retain lower limbs longer, right? So trees don't self-prune as rapidly. That reduces log quality because you end up with larger knots. But it's done for habitat enrichment purposes in places like LSR. If you can retain those lower limbs longer, you get deeper canopies and you get sort of the development of multi-layered canopies faster. But the trade-off is bigger knots, which is going to reduce log quality and maybe even eliminate certain markets like utility pole markets. The other kind of big impact of retention level on wood quality outside of that tends to be tree growth rate, right? We know in Douglas fir, slower grown trees contribute to higher density wood, which means higher quality for structural lumber purposes. And the lower the density in the stand, or a tree that's growing right on the edge of one of these gaps, so it has a less competitive environment around it, it's going to have faster individual tree growth rates. So in the context of that wood density component of log quality, it's going to have lower log quality than something that's grown in a little bit higher density environment. So a real good question. We do have, some research to support some inferences about how different retention levels would impact some of those quality elements, and certainly something to think about in the kind of experimental design for these extensive treatments in terms of what to monitor moving forward. All right, so moving along. I mentioned that small gaps, really these half acre smaller gaps that we see in a lot of the thinning kinds of approaches, really aren't effective for promoting Douglas fir regeneration. But gap-based approaches that use bigger gaps, say 2.5 acres and up, have been shown to be relatively effective in promoting fairly rapid growth of understory Douglas fir and high levels of survival, and basically a good competitive environment for Douglas fir to be able to outcompete neighboring species. Pattern of retention and level of retention have also been looked at in terms of impact on understory communities, which sort of understory plant communities, which sort of cascades into broader concerns about biodiversity conservation that would be relevant in these extensive forest units. And we have some good research there. Some of the best research in this region comes out of something called the DEMO study, which was set up specifically to look at different levels of dispersed versus aggregated retention. And some of the key results there are that in general, responses to retention level vary among taxa, and so do responses to retention pattern. An early cereal plant, so one thing we would want to be doing in these extensive treatment areas is creating some high quality early cereal habitat for biodiversity conservation purposes. Early cereal plants tend to benefit from lower retention levels and aggregated retention, which makes sense. Early cereal vegetation tends to be associated with more open and high resource environments, and you get that from lower retention and sort of more open areas between aggregates in aggregated retention systems. Late successional vegetation tends to benefit from the opposite conditions, higher retention levels, or within those unharvested leaf islands in an aggregated retention system. The species or the groups, the taxa, that have been shown to be most sensitive to kind of any kind of harvesting, no matter what you're doing, in the understory tend to be fungi, lichens, and mosses and other bryophytes. These have been shown to be really sensitive to harvesting and to take many, many decades to recover following harvesting. So one of the key sort of conclusions that we can derive from these studies is providing refugia for these species in terms of those unharvested leaf patches or reserve blocks in your Triad watersheds is one of the key elements of maintaining these more sensitive species, understory species on the landscape. And in fact, research shows that while smaller aggregates, smaller leaf islands of say an acre or less aren't very effective at supporting some of these more sensitive taxa like fungi, lichens, and bryophytes, incorporating larger leaf islands of say 2.5 acres and up into your harvest units can be a pretty effective way to maintain the populations of some of those more sensitive species. Okay. And moving along, there's also a lot of studies.
Matt, you've got I hate to do this to you, just a couple more minutes, and then we'll have to turn our attention to public comment before we run out of time.
Sure. Well, real quickly, basically the same idea for wildlife communities as with plants, right? So responses to harvest level and spatial pattern are really dependent on taxa. The more early cereal associated wildlife species, or sorry, I got that in reverse of my points on the slide. The more late successional forests, so old growth forest associated wildlife species, tend to be better supported by higher levels of retention. More early cereal associated wildlife species tend to be better supported by lower levels of retention. So that maintain both of those kinds of species in a landscape managed with these extensive approaches, you really have to have a range of retention levels. That's kind of the key take home. A few other considerations in retention harvests. Wind throw risk is a concern in terms of residual trees that contributes to sort of long-term, economic value, but also their long-term impact on other ecosystem functions. And that tends to be highest in dispersed retention. We'll skip some of these points to move, I think, along to just a quick note that a second sort of suite of approaches that we look at in these systems are thinning in between these regeneration harvests, and particularly variable density thinning, where we might incorporate gaps, unharvested leaf islands, things like that within a thin matrix. Since we don't have a lot of time, I'll flip through these slides pretty quickly to just say the higher residual density you leave when you're doing thinning approaches, generally the greater your wood productivity is going to be, but the trade-off is reduced understory vegetation development, reduced opportunities for development of mid-stories and things like that are associated with late cereal habitat. And another important trade-off to think about as we think forward into potential impacts of climate change in these coastal forests is the potential for more drought. This is from a master's student of mine who just defended her thesis. It's basically showing the higher level of residual density we have following thinning, the lower the resistance and resilience to drought is. So thinning more heavily promotes greater drought resistance and resilience, but has some trade-offs with things like wood production. Kind of to wrap up, there's also a whole lot of evidence that just doing a single treatment of any sort doesn't necessarily maintain some of the structural development and habitat development objectives that you might be trying to achieve with something like a variable density thinning treatment. So there's a lot of evidence that we really need to be thinking about sort of stringing treatments together temporally in order to create complex or to accelerate development of complex forests in something like an extensively managed landscape. And skip some of this stuff since we're low on time to go to what are the big questions that the Elliott that we could potentially approach in these extensive areas on the Elliott. Well, there's some stand scale questions. One of them is we don't really have any studies that have sort of strung together multiple treatments. So have done a variable retention harvest and followed that in 30 or 40 years with a thinning or variable density thinning to see what the interactive effect of those treatments over time are on the landscape. And any kind of large long-term experimental opportunities that arise on a research forest like the Elliott would really give us a good chance to do that. We also have virtually no research in the Pacific Northwest about the potential use of uneven age silvicultural approaches, which would fit well in this extensive theme. And we don't know a lot about how different levels of herbicide application or alternative approaches to the management of competing vegetation interact with long-term tree regeneration, development, and growth, and stand productivity over time. So those are some good opportunities. We also don't know a lot about how these different, harvesting methods and systems are impacted by initial stand conditions. So stands of different initial ages, different species compositions, et cetera, which the Elliott offers some opportunities to look at. And then the other thing the Elliott offers is scale, right? We could have whole sub watersheds of potentially several hundred to thousands of acres that are all treated with extensive forestry, as well as sub watersheds that are in that triad theme that would include a mix of approaches. And that allows us an opportunity to look at some landscape scale questions that really haven't been examined at all with any of these approaches to extensive forestry or ecological silviculture or things along those lines. So big questions about how some of these alternative silvicultural approaches, when applied repeatedly over hundreds and thousands of acres, impact things like habitat connectivity for wildlife, impact things like stream flow, and impact the susceptibility of that landscape to disturbances like wildfire, drought, wind events, things along those lines. So there are some big, more landscape scale questions that we could apply these extensive approaches to, and really start to learn something that no other experiments anywhere in the US or anywhere in the world that I'm aware of have been able to look at this kind of a larger scale in terms of impacts of applying these alternative silvicultural approaches on landscape scale outcomes. Now, I guess I will end there since we are low on time.
Thanks, Matt. And again, apologies for rushing you through that. Shannon, I wondered if, as we transition here, both to public comment and then, but if you would be willing to talk a little bit about sort of this, sort of the presentations, kind of reviewing research opportunities, both aquatic and silviculture related, but sort of connecting that to the approach, the FMP development for the group. I think that'd be helpful by way of transition. And then Francis, I know we have you with a couple of questions, comments before we transition to next steps. And I'm hoping folks can just hang in there just a few minutes longer than 2 o'clock.
I'll keep it really brief, Peter, because I know we are very short on time. So yes, next steps, as these working groups continue to come together around specific products and drafting sections of the FMP, a lot of the ideas that we heard about today with aquatic and riparian and extensive, that's where we'll be continuing to dig into the details of what this looks like as part of the forest management plan, as well as feeding into the monitoring plan and the adaptive management strategy. So we have FMP sections linked with each of the working groups as subject matter experts, contributors, reviewers, and authors. And that includes not just core working group members, but members of this advisory committee and others as well, who would also come in and provide that additional perspective at that stage. And so moving forward, we're working on drafting those sections with the information that we currently have, as well as including notes for where continued outputs from these working groups, if they're not immediately available, will slot in the coming months, as well as sharing those outputs and drafts for review and input, with our major milestone being by this November to have those key draft sections ready. So that involves multiple cycles of review, of incorporating information that we already have from the research proposal, from other foundational documents, including the HCP and previous forest management plans, as well as we've said, the new information coming out of these working groups. And one of those major areas that we talked about today is that refinement of the Triad experimental design and highlighting these locations for early implementation as well as monitoring, so we can start to pick up some of the signals that we hope to see in those first X number of years.
Thanks, Shannon. Any quick questions, comments from the committee before I go to Francis and then Sue? Okay. Francis? Still with us? There you are.
Yes, I am still with you. Say, I was wondering about the fate of East Hackey, and I understand that you aren't going to do anything with it until the appraisal is done. So if it doesn't get added to the forest management plan at this time, what is the process to add East Hackey to those West Side reserves after the appraisal is done to add it to the forest management plan?
Shannon, you came off mute. I'm not sure we have a good answer for you right now, Francis, but it's an important question, and I think we could probably get back to you. Unless Shannon, did you have a response?
No, that's pretty much what I was going to say.
I've got a response.
Yeah. I honestly don't have time for a lengthy conversation about the future of East Hackey today, but nor do we have all the right people to have that conversation, I think, in the room. But appreciate you raising it, and it merits more discussion in the future. Thanks, Francis. And then your second question?
Well, I just want to point out that East Hackey was not included in the just released habitat conservation plan for the Western Oregon forest. So it's sort of an orphan hanging out there. It really belongs in with this process, and it wasn't included with the other process. Just take that. And my other question had to do with the coastal martin, and I didn't see it when you had your little graphs up of endangered species. You only included the endangered species already included in the habitat conservation plan, and there's other endangered species on the Elliott not included in that HCP, one of which is the coastal martin. And so I assume that the forest management plan will describe the surveys required to determine non-presence before you do a habitat disturbance, right? And it's going to do that for the coastal martin.
That's a great point to bring up, Francis. And yes, the subgroups that I had highlighted under that that conservation strategy group were specifically just related to the HCP, but we are discussing how the coastal martin and other species would also be woven into that FMP. So it's not that they're not part of the conversation, they're a really important piece. But in that chart, I was just highlighting the HCP. And that was a point that Bob Salinger had brought up earlier as well. And I've had those discussions with him as well. So we are working on integrating that piece as well into the FMP. And as Katie said earlier as well, into some of the biodiversity sampling that's being planned for the forest too. So we can make sure that we have the appropriate level of monitoring to fully understand what's going on in the landscape.
Thank you. And I just have another really quick comment on the silvicultural report that we just heard, where the gentleman talked about we're going to look at different applications of herbicides and pesticides on the forest. And I would encourage you to do a study comparing the adjacent Coos Bay BLM regeneration harvest, where they do no herbicide applications for commodity production. And that would be a great little experiment to look at how well their forest regenerates compared to how well your forest regenerates applying those chemicals. There, that's the end of my comment.
Thanks, Francis. Appreciate it. Sue?
Okay, I put my email in there. If you want to respond to me that way, that's just fine. And I would like Bill Ryan with DSL to be a part of this also. When I think of these forests, I can see you are all so excited about what you are wanting to do. And of course, it's all from the forest point of view, from forestry. This has been the whole thing here. I was hoping we would see a much larger group of people involved. And one of the things I am fascinated with is how the Native population in the past, and with their input into it, lived near the forest, used the forest for medicinal purposes, for food, for everything that they used it for, wood, whatever. I would love to see us develop something like that. And I would like to see it plus all the stuff that you're doing with regeneration as a part of education for all groups of people. I'm an old woman, but I would love to come down there. I came over at one time to near Perpetua, Point Perpetua, and we camped out for 2 days. And Sierra Club and another group with the birds, we watched the marbled murrelets and watched them in their nests. It was incredible. And then we were able to go out on the coast and watch them in the water. And this kind of thing needs to be a part of what you are planning for this incredible area, because we just don't have those opportunities. And I hope that you're going to look at how much beavers store water for us, because they do. And if so, are you going to keep people from killing them? As you know, right now in the state of Oregon, you can get a license and go in and trap beavers. And so are you going to allow that? So I want to know a lot about this. And I also would love to see more just about what was just talked about by Francis, with comparing what has been done to our soil with the dreadful spraying that they do. There's an interconnectedness of all life. And when you go in and kill off with herbicides and rodenticides, et cetera, that has to have a huge effect on everything. Okay. Okay, so I think I hope those are my questions, okay? Thank you so much. I'm sorry, I'm trying to do this quickly for you.
No, I appreciate that. We appreciate your engagement and interest. And I think many of the topics that you just described will be elements that will be a part of the FMP, and they'll be described in detail in terms of management approach, et cetera. So
can I add just one response to the question about herbicide use?
No.
I just want to clarify.
You can email me.
Yeah, I just want to clarify. Actually, one of the broader pieces of management direction for those extensive harvest areas is to use no or minimal herbicide and allow for some of the kinds of comparison that I believe it was Francis was asking about, so that we can contrast those areas with what's going on in the intensively managed areas where there would be more herbicide use.
Thank you. And I missed one thing, recreation. I do not hunt and I do not fish for recreation. I do other things in the forest. And so get people involved, like Sierra Club has these wonderful things where they will come in and build trails and stuff like that.
Great suggestion. Thanks, Sue.
Thank you.
Very quickly.
Yes, Paul.
Just really quickly. It looks like we're looking at a date in June. If we could get that date sooner rather than later, June is crazy.
Yeah, so the intent actually was that we were going to try to nail that stuff down today during this meeting, as well as get ideas about what you'd like to see while you're on the forest together. So, and instead of holding you to do that right now, we will send you an email this week, getting a date, asking for your ideas for what you'd like to see and visit while you're on the forest, and solidifying upcoming FMP meetings and engagement opportunities. So we'll do all of that via email, and then get things scheduled out as far in advance as possible so that you can plan accordingly. One note is that, so we'll take care of all that. And Paul duly noted June is one thing, and then it only gets probably more challenging as we get into July and August. So, yeah, thanks for raising it, and we'll get on it. Anything else for the good of the order? Thanks everybody for being here. Well, more information to come, and appreciate the engagement from Matt, Gordy, and Dana as well. All right, thanks everybody. Have a great rest of your day.
Good to see you all. Bye-bye.
Bye.